As shadows lengthen across the backdrop of the mid-20th century, an ominous presence emerges from the Iron Curtain. From the dark lands of Romania, the Securitate rule with a fist of control and suppression. Established in August 1948 under the directive of Gheorghe Gheorghiu-Dej and later Nicolae Ceaușescu, the Securitate, Communist Romania's state security department, unleashed a reign of terror unlike anything Romania had ever seen, enforcing the will of the state. The interrogation rooms of the Securitate's infamous headquarters, perhaps in the dreaded Pitești prison, became the nerve center of this terrifying organization. This brutal re-education experiment was part of the broader communist regime's efforts to crush dissent and enforce ideological conformity among Romania's prison population, only to spread beyond the barred walls into the mountains and countryside, tainting the plains with evil, like dark, poisonous ink, staining the pages of history over the next 40 years. But how did the Securitate operate? What were their true goals? And what were the terrifying techniques used by the Securitate to enforce the people to cower from the visage of oppression? Can you imagine the creeping terror of a knock on the door in the dead of night? Is it possible to comprehend that your leaders might starve you and torture you unless you bow down to their power? Radu Gheorghe, a notable Romanian poet who suffered under communist rule and endured imprisonment for his beliefs, reflecting his experience and suffering during these poisoned times, emphasizes resilience in the face of oppression. We are all on the cross, but the crosses are blooming. Join us as we delve into the heart of oppression and darkness that was the Securitate, peeling back the layers of fear, brutality, and unyielding control. Welcome to the Chronicles of the Raven. Chapter 1. Evil Emergence and Mission of the Securitate. The genesis of the Securitate was anchored in the early tremors of the Cold War, an era characterized by intense global tension and ideological divide. Officially established on August 30, 1948, the organization materialized as a pivotal instrument in the hands of the Romanian Communist Party, or PCR. Its inception was not merely an internal decision, but a reflection of the larger Cold War dynamics, particularly the Soviet Union's strategic push to expand and solidify its influence over Eastern Europe. What it would become, no one could have foreseen. In the realm of shadows and silence, the methods of the Securitate were both insidious and brutal. Psychological intimidation was a key tool. Citizens lived in constant fear of arbitrary arrest, interrogation, and the possibility of being sent to labor camps or prisons like Pitești, Gherla, or Aiud, notorious for their harsh conditions and torture methods, something we will investigate in a subsequent chapter. Before these locations became the centers of despair, the world was rapidly polarizing into two ideological blocs by the late 1940s. The Soviet Union, emerging victorious but significantly weakened from World War II, was intent on establishing buffer states in Eastern Europe. Romania, with its strategic location and political vulnerability, was a prime candidate for Soviet influence. The creation of the Securitate must be viewed through this prism. It was as much a response to internal political developments as it was to external pressures and the broader Stalinist model of state control. Romania's landscape in the immediate aftermath of World War II was marked by upheaval and uncertainty. The war had ravaged the country, leaving its political and social structures in disarray. The pre-war monarchy and the traditional political elite were struggling to maintain their relevance in a rapidly changing world. In this vacuum, the Communist Party, backed by the Soviet Union, found fertile ground for its ascent to power. By 1947, with the abdication of King Michael I and the establishment of the People's Republic of Romania, the Communist Party had effectively seized control. However, this control was tenuous at best. The party faced opposition from various quarters, former royalists, nationalists, and even moderate socialists who were wary of the Soviet influence. Ultimately, the people of Romania wanted to have a voice in their future, to shape it in a way that represented all of them, a dangerous notion for dictatorships who wished to control everyone. The Securitate was thus conceived not just as an intelligence and security apparatus, but as a critical tool to consolidate communist power. Its role was to ensure the Communist Party's unchallenged dominance and to aid in the transformation of Romania into a loyal Soviet satellite. This involved not just dealing with active resistance, but also preempting and stifling any potential opposition. From its inception, the Securitate's mission transcended traditional notions of state security. It was tasked with defending the Romanian state not just from external threats, but more critically, from internal challenges. The Securitate's early operations focused on rooting out the so-called enemies of the state. This encompassed a wide range of individuals and groups, members of the pre-communist government, intellectuals who were critical of the new regime, clergy who opposed the state's interference in religious affairs, and peasants who resisted agricultural collectivization. The period immediately following its establishment was marked by aggressive campaigns to dismantle any remnants of the old political order. Former politicians, army officers, and anyone with ties to the pre-communist regime were particularly targeted. The Securitate conducted extensive investigations, often based on scant or fabricated evidence, to purge these elements from Romanian society. Intellectuals and the clergy posed a different kind of challenge. They wielded significant influence over public opinion and were capable of articulating an alternative vision for Romania's future, one that often contradicted the communist narrative. The Securitate employed a variety of tactics to silence these voices, from intimidation and surveillance to arrests and show trials. One of the most significant and enduring aspects of the Securitate's mission was its campaign against peasants resisting collectivization. The collectivization of agriculture was a key tenet of the communist economic policy, but it met with stiff resistance from Romania's predominantly agrarian society, who wanted to maintain control over not only their land, but ancestral land. The Securitate played a crucial role in quelling this resistance, often resorting to force and coercion. This not only involved the physical suppression of revolts, but also a psychological campaign to break the will of the peasantry, ensuring they would trade one form of controlling rule for another, something that would only become more dire after Ceaușescu's ascent to power. Their methods were comprehensive and invasive. Surveillance was omnipresent, and the network of informants permeated every aspect of Romanian life. The agency operated with little regard for legal norms or human rights. Arbitrary arrests, torture, and forced confessions were common. The objective was clear: to instill a sense of fear and helplessness among the populace, thereby eliminating any thought of resistance. Nothing could oppose the state. It's here the organization would develop its ruthlessness and callous disregard for human life over the subsequent decades. The Securitate was instrumental in shaping the political, social, and cultural landscape of communist Romania, ensuring that every facet of life was aligned with the party's ideology. This marked the beginning of a dark chapter in Romania's history. But who were those in control, and what evil did they unleash upon their very own brothers and sisters? Chapter 2. The Architects of Control and Fear. The Securitate was not just an institution, but a reflection of the men who led it. These figures, pivotal in shaping its direction and tactics, have since become emblematic of the oppression and fear that marked Romania's communist era. While we will explore their brutal methods and their evolving goals in the next chapters, we must first discuss the leaders. Gheorghe Gheorghiu-Dej, the first communist leader of Romania, played a foundational role in the establishment of the Securitate. Dej was a figure molded by the interwar labor movement and the turbulent politics of the time. Rising through the ranks of the Romanian Communist Party, he became a central figure in its leadership. Dej's vision for the Securitate was clear. It was to be a bulwark against both internal dissent and external threats, particularly from the West and from Titoist Yugoslavia. Under his guidance, the Securitate was structured to mirror Soviet models, but with a distinctly Romanian character. Dej, who maintained a precarious balance of power, steering Romania away from total Soviet domination, understood the need for a strong internal security apparatus to consolidate his regime. He was instrumental in setting the tone for the Securitate's operations, a mix of political policing and guarding against perceived foreign influences. However, he was nothing compared to the vile, cruel, and disturbing leader who would follow. Nicolae Ceaușescu's ascent to power in 1965 marked a new chapter for the Securitate. Born on January 26, 1918, in Stranglehold, Ceaușescu rose from a background of poverty to become one of the most controversial figures in Romanian history. Initially seen as a reformer, his regime gradually evolved into one of the most repressive in the Eastern Bloc. Ceaușescu transformed the Securitate into an instrument of his increasingly paranoid and megalomaniacal vision. He expanded its role from a mere intelligence-gathering agency to an all-encompassing organ of control and repression. Under Ceaușescu, the Securitate reached new heights of infamy, becoming synonymous with his autocratic rule. His reliance on the Securitate was marked by an obsessive focus on surveillance and the systematic elimination of political opponents. Ceaușescu's tenure saw the Securitate grow in size and scope, with its tentacles reaching into every aspect of Romanian life. From bugging devices in private homes to informants in workplaces and schools, the Securitate became a pervasive presence, embodying Ceaușescu's distrust of his own people. Alexandru Dragici, the enforcer. Alexandru Dragici, a key figure in the Securitate's leadership, was Ceaușescu's right-hand man in matters of state security. As the head of the Interior Ministry, which oversaw the Securitate, Dragici was responsible for some of the harshest repressive measures. He had a background in the communist youth movement and was known for his ruthless efficiency. Dragici was instrumental in orchestrating the Securitate's campaign against dissidents and intellectuals. He was the architect behind numerous violent purges and show trials, ensuring that any threat to the regime was swiftly and often brutally neutralized. General Iulian Vlad, the last head of the Securitate, served during the final years of Ceaușescu's regime. Appointed in 1987, Vlad was a career officer who had risen through the ranks of the Securitate. His tenure was marked by the agency's increased brutality in the face of growing public dissent. Vlad's role during the 1989 revolution remains a subject of debate. Some reports suggest he was reluctant to order the shooting of protesters, while others paint him as a loyalist to the end. His actions during this tumultuous period were indicative of the Securitate's complex relationship with Ceaușescu's regime, torn between loyalty to the leader and recognition of the regime's impending collapse. The leadership of the Securitate, from Dej to Vlad, reflects the evolution of Romania's communist regime. Each leader imprinted his vision, molding it to suit their objectives. From its inception as a tool for consolidating communist power to its role as the enforcer of Ceaușescu's personal dictatorship, the Securitate mirrored the ambitions and fears of its leaders. Their rule was marked by a common theme: the use of fear and repression as instruments of control. Under their guidance, the Securitate became a symbol of the regime's power and its willingness to maintain this power at any cost. Chapter 3. Web of Control. The Organization and Hierarchy. The sprawling web of the Securitate under their leaders was designed to monitor and manipulate, extending its influence far beyond the confines of conventional espionage or policing. At the heart of the Securitate's operation were its numerous directorates, each tasked with a specific domain of surveillance and enforcement. The Counter-Espionage Directorate focused on foreign threats, real or often imagined, seeking to root out foreign spies and prevent external influences from permeating the Iron Curtain. Meanwhile, the Internal Surveillance Directorate cast its gaze inward, scrutinizing the lives of ordinary citizens for any hint of dissent or deviation from the party line. This division was notorious for its extensive use of wiretaps, mail interception, and covert surveillance operations, turning personal privacy into a myth. The Directorate for Penitentiaries and Labor Camps oversaw the regime's more overt instruments of repression. It managed the infamous prisons and labor camps where perceived enemies of the state were sent to be re-educated through brutal means. These institutions became symbols of the Securitate's ruthlessness, places where the human spirit was systematically broken under the guise of ideological purification. The Securitate's pervasive reach was its most insidious feature. It infiltrated every corner of Romanian life, from the industrial heartlands of factories to the intellectual hubs of universities, down to the pastoral tranquility of rural communities. Its network of informants, both voluntary and coerced, was vast, creating an environment where trust was eroded by the constant threat of surveillance. Friends, neighbors, even family members could be informants. a reality that sowed division and isolated individuals in a sea of suspicion. This network was not random, but meticulously crafted to ensure that no segment of society was beyond observation. Agents and informants were embedded within all critical institutions, trade unions, academic circles, religious congregations, ensuring that the Securitate's eyes and ears were ever present. This strategy effectively turned the state into an omnipotent overseer capable of detecting the slightest ripple of opposition before it could swell into a wave of dissent. Despite the rigid hierarchy that dictated the Securitate's operations, agents often operated with a chilling degree of autonomy. This freedom was a double-edged sword. It allowed for initiative and adaptability, but also led to abuses of power. Agents, emboldened by the state's tacit endorsement, could interpret their mandates broadly, leading to excesses in their zeal to unearth or manufacture signs of disloyalty. This autonomy, coupled with the lack of accountability, made the Securitate not just a tool of state control, but a shadowy empire unto itself, with its own codes and loyalties. The Securitate's web of control and fear was thus both expansive and intimate, casting a shadow over public squares and private lives alike. Its blend of widespread surveillance, targeted repression, and the cultivation of mistrust fractured communities and instilled a pervasive sense of insecurity. This atmosphere of pervasive mistrust and fear ensured not just the suppression of dissent, but the fragmentation of society into a mosaic of isolated individuals, forever wary of the unseen watcher over their shoulder. Chapter 4: Brutal Interrogation Methods and Psychological Warfare. At the heart of the Securitate's strategy was psychological intimidation. The mere specter of the Securitate's gaze was enough to stifle whispers of dissent, turning society into a silent choir of the compliant. Fear was sown with the precision of a surgeon through rumors of vanishing citizens and tales of midnight arrests. The populace lived under a constant cloud of anxiety, aware that any deviation from the state's decrees result in disappearance into the void of Romania's most notorious prisons, Pitești, Gheorghe, or Aiud. These institutions were not merely places of incarceration, but laboratories of human suffering. Here, the Securitate sought to break the spirit through a regimen of psychological and physical torment. Pitești became infamous for its re-education experiment, a brutal campaign aiming to rebuild individuals into the perfect socialist citizen. Prisoners were subjected to relentless degradation, forced to betray their deepest convictions and turn against their comrades. The process systematically dismantled their identity, leaving behind a shell amenable to the regime's indoctrination. Physical torture accompanied psychological warfare, with methods designed to inflict maximum pain without leaving visible scars. Inmates endured beatings, electric shocks, and extreme sensory deprivation. Some were forced into stress positions for hours, or subjected to extreme temperatures, oscillating between the agony of heat and the torment of cold. Others faced mock executions, living perpetually on the edge of death, a psychological torment that eroded the will to resist. Gheorghe, located in Cluj County, has a dark history that predates the communist era, having been constructed in the 18th century. However, it was during the communist period that Gheorghe gained its notoriety as a site of severe political repression. The prison was used to detain a wide array of political prisoners, including intellectuals, clergy, former politicians, and anyone else deemed a threat to the communist regime. Under Ceaușescu, Gheorghe became synonymous with brutal treatment and inhumane conditions. Prisoners were subjected to beatings, water immersion, exposure to extreme temperatures, and forced labor in hazardous conditions without proper food or medical care. The regime's goal was not just to punish, but to eliminate any opposition, real or perceived, using fear and suffering as tools of control. The atmosphere within Gheorghe was one of constant surveillance and mistrust, with prisoners often turning on each other under pressure from their captors. The legacy of Gheorghe prison is a testament to the resilience of those who survived, many of whom went on to document their experiences and bear witness to the atrocities committed behind its walls. Aiud prison, located in Alba County, shares a similarly grim history. Established in the early 20th century, Aiud became one of the primary facilities for the detention of political prisoners during the communist era. Like Gheorghe, Aiud was a place of severe repression, where inmates faced systematic abuse, torture, and neglect. The conditions in Aiud were notoriously harsh. Prisoners lived in overcrowded cells, suffered from inadequate nutrition and health care, and were forced into labor that often served no purpose other than to inflict more suffering. Psychological torture, including isolation, humiliation, and constant threats of further violence or execution, was used to suppress any spirit of defiance or hope among the inmates. Aiud's significance lies not only in the cruelty it symbolized, but also in the role it played in attempting to crush the intellectual and moral opposition to communist rule. Many of Romania's brightest minds and most steadfast resistors were imprisoned in Aiud, where they faced efforts to break their will and silence their voices. The climate of fear meticulously crafted by the Securitate extended beyond prison walls, permeating every facet of Romanian society. Privacy became an obsolete concept, as the state's eyes and ears infiltrated homes, workplaces, and even intimate conversations. The Securitate's network of informants, coupled with technological surveillance, ensured that no space remained sacred, no dialogue truly private. This omnipresent surveillance served a dual purpose. It rooted out dissent while also instilling a pervasive sense of paranoia, transforming neighbors into potential spies and silencing even the most mundane complaints against the state. The ultimate objective of the Securitate's methods was not merely to control the populace, but to reshape Romanian society according to the regime's vision. By instilling fear and obedience, the state sought to fashion a new type of citizen, one who not only accepted the communist ideology, but also participated in its enforcement. This reconfiguration of society was predicated on the erosion of individuality and the suppression of free thought, creating an environment where the state's narrative went unchallenged and truth became a malleable concept, subject to the whims of the regime. The legacy of the Securitate's methods of torture and intimidation is a scarred national psyche. The institutions of terror may have crumbled, but the memories linger, casting long shadows over the collective memory of the Romanian people. The tales of horror that seeped from the walls of Pitești, Gheorghe, and Aiud serve as grim reminders of the depths to which humanity can sink in the pursuit of power and control. In reflecting on this dark chapter of Romania's past, it becomes evident that the Securitate's true horror lay not in the individual acts of torture, but in its systematic approach to dismantling the human spirit. Chapter 5. The notorious events in the decades of darkness. In the years following its inception, the Securitate's focus was on eliminating any opposition to the communist regime. This involved widespread purges, particularly targeting former members of the pre-communist government, intellectuals, and anyone suspected of counter-revolutionary activities. The 1950s saw the Securitate orchestrating a series of show trials reminiscent of Stalin's purges, aiming to instill a climate of fear and demonstrate the regime's unassailable power. Their reach extended into cultural suppression, particularly against ethnic minorities. The Hungarian minority in Transylvania faced significant persecution, with their cultural institutions being dismantled and leaders arrested or harassed. This systematic oppression was part of a broader strategy to assimilate and control minority groups, central to the Securitate's ethos of maintaining a homogenized society under communist control. One of the most chilling chapters in the Securitate's history relates to its role in quashing the influence of the 1956 Hungarian Revolution in Romania. The Romanian Communist Party observed with a mixture of alarm and anticipation as their Hungarian neighbors rose against Soviet influence and communist authoritarianism. While Romania did not experience a revolution of the same magnitude, the spirit of defiance across the border sparked a ripple of unrest and a wave of solidarity among the Romanian populace. The Securitate responded with a tightening grip, increasing surveillance and stifling any whisper of dissent that dared to emerge. The fear of a domino effect led to a brutal crackdown on Hungarian communities and anyone expressing solidarity with the revolutionaries. This event was marked by mass arrests, intensive interrogations, and a heightened state of surveillance that left a lasting impact on the collective psyche of the Romanian people. The decades of the 1960s and 1970s under Nicolae Ceaușescu's regime marked a dark chapter in Romanian history, characterized by an oppressive atmosphere where the shadow of the Securitate loomed large over society. Ceaușescu's rule was a misled blend of grandiose visions for Romania's future and draconian measures to achieve them, often at the expense of the population's well-being and fundamental human rights. In July 1971, after a visit to North Korea and China, Ceaușescu was inspired by the personality cults he observed and initiated a series of drastic measures to reshape Romanian society, culture, and education along strict socialist lines. The era was defined by an Orwellian state of surveillance and control, where the mere hint of dissent could invite severe repercussions. In Ceaușescu's Romania, the Securitate's tentacles reached deep into the fabric of everyday life, weaving a dense network of informants and spies that permeated every layer of society to an extreme. Intellectuals, artists, and even ordinary citizens found themselves ensnared in a web of surveillance designed to suppress any deviation from the official party line. The regime's paranoia dictated that one did not need to be an actual enemy to be punished. Mere suspicion or association could seal one's fate. This climate of fear effectively stifled free expression, as writers, academics, and thinkers were forced to navigate the treacherous waters of censorship and state approval. The Securitate's influence extended into the realms of culture and education, where works of literature, art, and academic research were subject to scrutiny and sanction, ensuring that only those that glorified the socialist state and its leaders were promoted. Ceaușescu initiated a vast urbanization project known as systematization, aiming to transform Romania's rural landscape and reduce the number of villages by half. Many rural residents were forcibly relocated to urban centers, and historic buildings and churches were demolished to make way for standardized apartment blocks. This not only disrupted traditional ways of life, but also eroded cultural heritage. Human rights abuses were widespread, including the denial of freedom of expression, assembly, and religion. The use of torture and other cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment against political prisoners was reported. The regime also controlled many aspects of personal life, including a ban on contraception and abortion as part of a policy to increase the population, leading to illegal and unsafe procedures and a surge in the number of children in orphanages under deplorable conditions. Industrial policies led to significant environmental degradation. Pollution from chemical plants, factories, and poorly managed agricultural programs resulted in harm to the health of the population and the natural environment. As Romania entered the 1980s, the country was gripped by a deepening economic and social crisis. Shortages of basic necessities became commonplace, and the standard of living plummeted, leading to widespread discontent among the populace. Ceaușescu, increasingly isolated and paranoid, doubled down on his repressive tactics in a desperate bid to maintain control. The Securitate's role during this tumultuous period grew even more aggressive and invasive. The interception of private communications became routine, with the state eavesdropping on phone conversations, reading personal letters, and monitoring other forms of communication. This intrusion into private life was not just about gathering intelligence, but served as a psychological tactic to remind citizens that the state was always watching, always listening. The use of informers reached unprecedented levels, with neighbors spying on neighbors, colleagues reporting on colleagues, and even family members turning on each other. This network of informants was not limited to the political sphere, but extended into every aspect of Romanian life, from workplaces to schools, and even religious institutions. The Securitate infiltrated churches and religious groups, viewing them as potential hotbeds of resistance to the regime. Clergy who spoke out against the state, or who were deemed too influential among their congregations, were surveilled, harassed, or arrested, with the church's potential as a source of opposition neutered by fear and repression. The Securitate's tactics during the 1980s laid bare the extent of Ceaușescu's paranoia and the brutality of his regime. The pervasive surveillance, the stifling of dissent, and the persecution of perceived enemies created an atmosphere of constant fear and mistrust. Intellectual freedom was curtailed, and the collective Romanian psyche was scarred by the oppressive measures employed by the state to cling to power. Chapter 6: International Purpose of the Securitate and its Decline. As a Cold War chess piece, the Securitate was not merely a tool of domestic oppression, but also a key player in the broader geopolitical game of the era. Its actions and strategies were deeply intertwined with the larger narrative of East-West tensions and the Soviet Union's influence over Eastern Europe. The agency's tactics and operations often mirrored or were influenced by those of its counterparts in neighboring Warsaw Pact countries. This included collaboration on intelligence operations, sharing of surveillance techniques, and joint efforts in suppressing dissident movements across the bloc. The Securitate played a significant role in enforcing the Soviet Union's will within Romania, often acting as an intermediary between Bucharest and Moscow. Beyond its borders, the Securitate engaged in espionage and intelligence gathering aimed at both Eastern and Western countries. This involved monitoring Romanian expatriates, infiltrating immigrant communities, and conducting operations against foreign governments and organizations perceived as hostile to the Romanian state. Under Ceaușescu, Romania maintained a somewhat independent foreign policy within the Eastern Bloc, occasionally diverging from Soviet directives. This unique stance was also reflected in the Securitate's operations, which, while primarily focused on internal security, occasionally took on a more nationalistic tone, aligning with Ceaușescu's vision of Romanian sovereignty and independence. Despite occasional divergences in foreign policy, the Securitate remained closely aligned with the KGB and other Soviet bloc intelligence agencies. This relationship was marked by a complex web of cooperation and competition as Ceaușescu navigated the intricate balance of maintaining autonomy while not straying too far from Moscow's orbit. The final act of the organization began as whispers of change swept across Eastern Europe in the late 1980s. This era of repression set the stage for the eventual uprising against Ceaușescu's regime in December 1989. The revolution was not just a rejection of Ceaușescu's dictatorial rule, but also a repudiation of the Securitate and its methods. The uprising, which started in Timișoara and quickly spread across the country, was a culmination of years of simmering discontent and the desire for freedom and dignity. In the final days of Ceaușescu's regime, the Securitate engaged in a desperate and ultimately futile attempt to suppress the revolution. This included violent confrontations with protesters, widespread arrests, and attempts to control information flow. However, the sheer magnitude of the public's demand for change rendered these efforts ineffective. Following Ceaușescu's ousting and execution, the Securitate was officially disbanded. Its demise was part of the broader dismantling of the communist apparatus in Romania, a process that was met with both relief and apprehension, given the depth of the Securitate's infiltration into society. The integration of some former Securitate members into the new security apparatus of post-communist Romania was a subject of controversy and debate, reflecting the complexities of transitioning from a totalitarian regime to a democratic society, and thus in turn conducting the same reprogramming on them as they had conducted on their own people, only this time with compassion. One can debate whether this is deserved, or perhaps a more cruel punishment was deserved for the deplorables who butchered a nation. But a country ruling from disaster, famine, pain, and suffering may not have had the energy to observe even more violence. Reflecting on the shadows of the past, our journey through the history of the Securitate reveals a sobering chapter in Romania's story. It is a tale of power, fear, and the human capacity for both cruelty and resistance. As we step back into the present, we carry with us the lessons learned from this dark period. The legacy of the Securitate continues to influence Romanian society, politics, and culture. The process of reckoning with this past is ongoing, as the country navigates the complexities of post-communist transformation and the challenges of building a democratic and open society. This is not easy when for decades it was impossible to know if your neighbor was a friend or a Securitate spy. When anything you said at any point could be used to take you away, In a way, the paranoias of the regime bled into its people, and that takes time to heal. The story of the Securitate transcends national borders, serving as a cautionary tale about the perils of unchecked governmental power and the erosion of civil liberties. It reminds us of the importance of vigilance in safeguarding democratic institutions and the rule of law. In the words of George Santayana, those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. As we close this chapter, we are reminded of the resilience of the human spirit in the face of adversity. The story of the Securitate, with all its darkness and complexity, also contains tales of courage, defiance, and the enduring quest for freedom and justice. Let us carry these lessons into the future, committed to building a world that values and upholds the dignity and rights of all people.